Arrival at the edge of nowhere. The train exhaled one last breath of steam before rattling off down the tracks, leaving behind only a swirl of dust and the soft clunk of leather soles on wood. Frances Kessler sat stiff-backed on a weathered crate beside the depot, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her carpet bag nestled against one boot, and a letter creased and reread to the edge of ruin tucked inside her skirt pocket. She was 23, though. The lines under her eyes and the slope of her shoulders made her seem older. Her gaze swept the platform once more, scanning for a figure she had memorized from Ink and Hope. A tall man in a brown hat, boots with silver toes, waiting by the station wall. But there were no brown hats, no silver-toed boots. Just a freight clerk moving crates, a boy with a broom sweeping in lazy arcs, and the station agent who had already looked at her twice like she was a misplaced parcel. The July sun pressed heavy against her corseted ribs, and the ache in her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Still, she remained seated. To stand would be to admit she had nowhere to go. Sitting, she could still pretend someone might come. She reached into her pocket and drew out the letter again, smoothing its worn edges as if that might restore its promise. Dated 2 months back, it bore the clean, deliberate script of Everett Collins, her fiancé by correspondence. "I will meet you myself," it read. "Look for a tall man in a brown hat by the station wall. You will know me by my boots." She had whispered those words to herself through sleepless nights on the train, each syllable a thread holding her together. A throat cleared near the depot office. "Ma'am," the station agent called. "You waiting on someone?" Frances looked up and nodded once. "Yes, sir. My fiancé." He offered a polite grimace. "Next train's not due until tomorrow." Then, after a beat, he disappeared inside, leaving her once more in the quiet scorch of abandonment. Frances kept her eyes on the tracks. She would wait until dark if she had to. A stranger in his place. 15 miles west, Wyatt Ellison tugged hard on the reins of his gelding and cursed under his breath at the busted wagon wheel lying crooked in the rutted dirt. The thing had split clean through at the creek, crossing a break that would have been funny if it weren't so damned inconvenient. He crouched beside the wreck, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, and muttered, "Damn it, Everett." If his cousin hadn't taken sick the week before, bedridden and coughing blood in Helena, Wyatt wouldn't be here at all. But Everett had begged him, rasping between fevered breaths, to ride east and meet the woman coming in on the train. "She's expecting someone," Everett had wheezed. "You go in my stead. Explain it to her. Make sure she's all right." Wyatt hadn't liked it, not one bit. But decency still meant something to him, so he'd saddled up and hitched the wagon with the intention of reaching the station by noon. Now, with the sun already dropping fast behind the hills and no spare wheel worth using, he was losing time. The second wheel was cracked to dry rot from too many winters left unpatched. No way to fix it without proper tools or another axle. He kicked a stone, cursed louder, and turned back to his horse. "We ride," he said aloud, more to himself than to the beast. The gelding snorted, ears flicking as if in agreement. Wyatt mounted up his long shadow, stretching over the dry brush. He wouldn't get there before dark, not now. But he would get there. He pressed his heels into the gelding's sides and galloped eastward, the trail rising in clouds of dust behind him. Somewhere ahead, a woman waited on a promise that had already been broken. A man with no flash. By the time Frances pulled her shawl tight against the warmth still lingering in the air, the depot was empty. its windows shuttered and the platform boards cooling in the dusk. She was alone. No one had come. No one had sent word. Her throat felt as dry as the prairie dirt, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stood slowly, her knees unsteady beneath her skirt, and reached for her carpet bag. She had sold her mother's locket to pay for the train fare. Left behind her job at the dry goods store, her small room at the boarding house, and her sister's cautious warnings. All for a man she had never met, but believed would keep his word. She stepped off the platform, uncertainly weighing the $2 tucked in her change purse. There was a hotel down the road, but it wouldn't last her more than 2 nights. And after that, Kansas City was 100 miles and a world away. She took a shaky breath, then flinched at the sound of a horse behind her. "Miss Kessler." The voice was low and rough, like gravel dragged across wood. She turned sharply. A man had dismounted by the edge of the platform, tall and trail-worn with dust on his shoulders, and a face lined from the sun. His hat was dark gray, not brown. His boots were plain-toed, not silver-tipped. Still, there was something in his eyes, steady kind, not pitying. "I'm Wyatt Ellison," he said, removing his hat. "Everett's cousin." Francis stared at him. Her fingers curled tighter around the handle of her bag. "He took ill last week." "Fever," Wyatt continued, voice quieter now. "I came in his place. He asked me to meet you. I'm sorry I'm late, the wagon broke down." "So he's not coming," she said, her voice hollow. "No, ma'am," Wyatt said, jaw tightening. "He's in no state to travel. But he thought you'd be better off knowing." She didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Instead, she stood silent, her hand still pressed to the carpet bag. "Do you have a place to stay?" Wyatt asked. "No," he nodded, once then looked away. "There's a boarding inn in town. I'll cover the cost." "I don't take charity," she said, spine stiffening. His gaze met hers even. "Then call it a debt for wasting your time." After a pause, she nodded. Wyatt stepped beside her and walked toward town, his horse trailing behind. They didn't speak again for a while. The sky above them turned a deep violet, and the wind picked up like a whisper of something new. Small gestures, quiet rooms. The innkeeper gave her a room with a slanted ceiling and a narrow bed that creaked when she sat on it. The wash basin was chipped and the window stuck when she tried to open it, but it was clean and quiet, more than she had hoped for when she stepped off that platform with nothing but a carpet bag and a letter that no longer meant anything. Wyatt had left the coins on the counter without asking if she'd accept them, tipped his hat once, and walked out into the dusk with the kind of quiet she didn't know how to answer. Francis stood at the small window and watched him ride away, his shoulders upright in the saddle, the trail dust rising behind him like a fading promise. She'd just met him, barely exchanged a dozen words. And yet something about the way he had looked at her, steady, not embarrassed or apologetic, settled somewhere in her chest. He hadn't offered pity, just space, just enough room for dignity. She sat on the edge of the bed and let her hands fall to her lap, her gloves still creased from the long ride. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe this wasn't the end of everything. She lay back on the quilted blanket without unpinning her hair and stared at the ceiling until sleep came slow and reluctant. But Wyatt didn't sleep. He lay on a bedroll near the broken wagon under the wide Montana stars, the sky wheeling above him in silence. The night was cool, the wind light. But it wasn't the weather that kept him awake. It was her eyes. Not their color, which he hadn't registered in the fading light, but the way they had looked when she asked. so he sent you. He had seen that look before on soldiers waiting for orders that would never come on mothers who had lost too much on his own face once in a stream that reflected more truth than he wanted. He hadn't expected her to be so proud, or so quiet, or so strong. Everett, for all his charms, hadn't deserved her. Wyatt knew that much now, and he couldn't stop thinking about how she had stood straight on that empty platform even when the world had turned sideways beneath her. Tomorrow he promised himself he would see her again, even if she didn't ask for it. You deserve the land. You were promised. Morning came slow and gold sliding through the slanted glass and across the floorboards in a quiet hush. Frances stood before the mirror, pinning her braid into a crown, her hands steady, even if her chest wasn't. The last clean collar she had stiff with travel creases still gleamed white enough to look respectable. Downstairs, the faint scent of coffee and fried cornmeal reached her nose, and she followed it like instinct. The dining room was modest, worn pine tables, and a faded lace curtain that didn't quite cover the window, but the innkeeper's wife waved her toward a seat without fuss. Frances ate slowly, folding each bite with precision, her eyes on the pattern of the tablecloth. She hadn't decided what came next, only that she wouldn't let herself sit idle and disappear. Wyatt walked in just as she set down her fork. He looked the same, trail-worn shirt damp from the pump-out, back his hat in one hand. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. "I hoped you'd still be here," he said, voice low. "I have nowhere else," she replied, tone even. He didn't sit until she nodded once. Then he took the seat across from her, resting his elbows lightly on the table, careful not to crowd. "I looked at the wagon," he said. "Axles cracked. I'll need to order a new one from Red Lodge. Could be a week." She met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "Why are you telling me this?" He shifted, not defensive, just honest. "Because I thought I might ride out to the homestead this afternoon. Bring back supplies, maybe set up a space for you if you'd rather not stay in town." Her fingers brushed her napkin. "I was promised a place there. Yes, Mum, and I mean to see that you get it." Frances studied him a long moment. "I'm not a charity case." "No, you're not," he said. "But you were given a promise. I figure it deserves to be honored, even if not the way you expected." Her expression softened a degree. "You're not like him?" His jaw flexed once. "No, I'm not." She stood smoothing her skirt. "I'll come with you." He blinked. "To the homestead I can ride," she said, "and I won't be left behind again." He stood too slower. "All right." First steps on hollow soil. They left by mid-morning. Wyatt had borrowed a second horse from the livery and adjusted the stirrups for her without comment. Frances accepted the reins with a curt nod, mounting in one smooth motion that belied how long she'd been off a saddle. The trail west stretched quiet and wide, the dust rising soft from the horses' hooves. They didn't speak much. The wind carried the scent of pine and something cleaner than the soot of train cars and city brick. Midday found them beside a narrow stream, the kind that barely showed on maps. Frances dismounted first, walking to the edge of the water and kneeling to splash her face. Wyatt stayed by the trail, respecting her space. "You were in the war," she said, suddenly still facing the stream. "I was," he replied. "Cavalry, infantry, Missouri regiment." She stood slowly, drying her hands on her skirt. "You came back whole." He looked at her, then at the ground. Not entirely. They didn't speak of it again. As the sun climbed higher, the land around them began to shift. Fewer trees, more sage and scrub. Then the fence line appeared weathered posts, leaning with the weight of years and wind. The house came into view just after modest and square 2 rooms, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Frances dismounted stiffly, her legs sore, but her spine straight. Wyatt led the horses to the trough and then stepped to the door. "I'll let you go in first," he said. She opened the door and stepped inside alone. The smell of ash and dry wood met her first. The stove in the corner was cold but clean. There was a table with 1 chair a cot against the far wall and a trunk at its foot. No curtains on the window, but the light poured in soft and quiet. Frances stood there a long moment, then turned back. Wyatt waited on the porch. "It's yours now, if you want it." She stepped outside the door, closing quietly behind her. "It's plain," she said, "but it's solid. I figured that mattered more." "I can work," she said. "I can sew. Keep hens. I'm not afraid of dirt. I didn't think you were." She turned to him fully. "Then why are you really helping me?" He didn't look away. "Because when I saw you standing there like you'd been torn up and stitched back wrong, I knew I couldn't just ride past it." Her eyes narrowed. "And what do you want in return?" "I don't want anything you don't want to give," he said simply. Frances crossed her arms, not in defiance, but to steady herself. "I'll need time. You can have it." The wind picked up stirring dust and something else between them. She glanced at the horizon. "I'd like some coffee, if you have any." He nodded the barest smile at the corner of his mouth. "I'll start the fire." Routines of the broken-hearted. The fire crackled low in the stove, sending a faint warmth through the wooden bones of the house. Frances sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, the metal still hot from the boil. Her fingers ached from the ride, the unfamiliar pull of reins and the jolt of the trail still lingering in her wrists. But she didn't complain. She only sat steady, staring into the small fire, as if trying to memorize its shape. Wyatt moved behind her with a quiet that felt intentional. He set a sack of oats on the shelf, unbuckled his boots by the door, and dropped onto the floor cross-legged. The hush between them wasn't uncomfortable. It held something else, like waiting, or maybe watching the way tall grass shifts under wind, but never rustles loud enough to disturb. "I'll take the cot," Frances said, without turning. "You said the barn, but this place is too far out to sleep apart." He looked at her back, her braid falling slightly loose over one shoulder. "All right," he answered simply. He stretched out by the far wall, coat rolled under his head, arms folded across his chest. She could see the flicker of the firelight painting soft gold across the lines beside his eyes. They didn't speak for a while, just listened to the wind moving across the ridges and the subtle tick of cooling wood. "You build this?" she asked, suddenly tapping her cup on the rim. "My father did. I helped raise the fence line, but he set the beams." Still living, Wyatt shook his head once. "Died during the hard winter, 4 years back." She nodded slightly. "Your mother buried beside him." Frances studied the way his boots cast long shadows on the floorboards. "Mine passed when I was 12. Consumption. My sister took in boarders, worked the store. I joined her when I was old enough to iron shirts and count change." "She's still back east?" he asked. "She married a wheelwright. 2 boys now. I didn't want to be the aunt in the corner room forever." She poured the last sip of coffee into the basin and set the cup upside down on the shelf. Then, almost as an afterthought, she turned to him. "There's a patch of ground north of the house," he said. "Been left too long. Might do well for a garden if the spring's wet." That's hopeful thinking. It's good land. Just needs someone to tend it. She reached behind her head and unpinned her braid, shaking it out slowly. "And you figure that someone's me? I figure you've got your own mind about it." She turned to him, her eyes darker now in the low firelight. "Would you still want me here if Everett had come instead?" He met her gaze without flinching. He didn't. "And I'm not sorry." Something worth building. Francis crossed the room slow and even and knelt to fold the quilt at the foot of the cot. Her fingers worked methodically, smoothing creases, squaring edges. It wasn't just a quilt, it was a gesture. She didn't speak for a long time, just moved with quiet purpose. "I don't know what comes next," she said at last, voice low. "I'm not asking you to," Wyatt replied. "Not tonight." The fire had burned down to a soft orange glow. Francis pulled the quilt up over the cot and lay back, arms crossed beneath her head. Her breathing steadied with the rhythm of someone who had found stillness, even if not peace. Wyatt stretched out on the floor again, using his coat for a pillow. The wind shifted outside a loose shutter, tapping against the siding. In the quiet, her voice reached him from the dark. "Your boots." He blinked. "What about them? They don't have silver toes." He let out a breath that almost passed for a laugh. "Never cared for flash." She smiled, faintly unseen. "Neither do I." The room settled again, the hush between them thick but not heavy. Her eyes traced the slope of the ceiling beams while her mind wandered through places she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. She hadn't come looking for this. She hadn't come looking for him. But she wasn't sorry either. The next morning brought low clouds and the scent of wet earth. Rain had come lightly in the night, just enough to leave puddles near the barn and darken the porch boards. Francis stood in the doorway, arms folded, as she watched a pair of magpies dart between fence posts. Her shawl hung loose over her shoulders. Wyatt stepped out from the barn, with his sleeves rolled and collar damp from chopping kindling. He nodded toward the neat stack of wood by the door and leaned the axe against the wall. "I'll patch the corner of the hen house today," he said. Roof started to sag. Hens to go with it. Not yet, but I figured if the roof's sound, you might want to see about getting some. She didn't respond right away, just nodded once her eyes still on the birds. "You sleep all right?" he asked. "I did," she said. "Woke once when the wind picked up. Thought I heard a wagon." He stepped up beside her, not too close. "You expecting someone?" She shook her head. "No, but I dreamed I was back at the depot, alone again. Felt like I'd never left." Wyatt looked toward the horizon. "Dreams'll do that. Pull you back into what you thought you outran." "I didn't think I outran anything. I just thought it might be different here." He let the silence settle. It still could be. First work, first trust. Francis turned to face him, her arms now folded for warmth. "I want to do something useful today, not just wait around for the stove to heat." Wyatt nodded, considering. "I've got a shed full of gear that needs sorting. Could use someone who knows a needle from a nail." She didn't smile, but her eyes sparked. "I'll start there." He led her around the house, past the rain-dark porch steps, and to the old tool shed leaning slightly westward. The door hung from one hinge, and when it swung open, the interior revealed a disarray of rusted tools, splintered crates, and a cracked seed grinder. Dust floated in the morning light like sleep that hadn't yet lifted. Francis rolled up her sleeves and knelt without hesitation. "You keep everything you've ever touched." Wyatt crouched beside her. Hard to throw things away when the town's half a day's ride and money's always thin. She lifted a broken lantern and examined the rim. "This one's past fixing." "I've got others," he said. She set it aside and reached for a coil of wire. This could patch a fence. They fell into rhythm, Francis sorting what could be salvaged, Wyatt stepping back to let her lead. By noon, she had made 2 neat piles, one for what was still worth something, the other for what needed to burn or be buried. Wyatt leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, watching her tie off the last bundle of wire with a strip of cloth. "You've got a good eye for what's worth keeping." She looked up briefly. "I had to learn. When you've only got one drawer for everything you own, you figure out what matters." He brushed sawdust from the old workbench. "You ever think about leaving Kansas City before you answered Everett's letter?" She sat back on her heels. "I used to watch the trains go by, wondered where they were headed. I didn't care where, just that they were moving." Wyatt nodded slowly. "I rode one after the war. Slept between 2 men who snored like bulls. Still felt like freedom." She smiled faintly, eyes on the floor. "Funny how much we'll trade for that feeling." They stood at the same time, brushing grit from their hands. "I'll heat a kettle," she said. "We can eat outside." Days of fire and quiet. They sat on the porch with tin cups balanced in their hands, the midday light warming the boards beneath their boots. The meal was simple. Boiled potatoes, salt pork, and water steeped just long enough to count as coffee. But it filled the silence between them like something earned. Wyatt leaned back against the post. One leg stretched out, his eyes scanning the sky for signs of weather. Francis sat upright, hands resting on her skirt, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though something might rise from it if she stared long enough. "You ever think about what you'd do if you could build something from scratch?" Wyatt asked, voice low. Francis traced the rim of her cup with one thumb. A place where nothing was borrowed, where the walls were mine. He waited, not rushing her. "I'd grow beans, keep a butter churn, maybe teach reading if the neighbors had children." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "That sounds like something worth building." She met his gaze. "Would you help?" "I would." There was no promise in his voice, no grand vow, just the quiet certainty of a man who meant what he said. They didn't speak after that. The sun crept lower in the sky, stretching shadows across the grass. A breeze passed through, gentle and full of dust, and neither of them moved. Something unspoken settled between them, not quite belonging, not yet love, but the first bones of something that could carry weight. The letter that didn't matter. The snow came early that year. By the first week of October, frost clung to the porch railings like lace, and the pasture grass dulled to a silvered gold. Francis stood outside with a basket of laundry, her shawl tight around her shoulders, breath rising in small clouds. The stove inside was already warm biscuits proofing under a cloth. Wyatt had risen before her again. In the steady rhythm of his hammer, echoed faintly from the lower field where he was laying new fence posts. She pinned shirts to the line, her stitches neat and strong. In the evenings, she had taken to reinforcing the seams of Wyatt's shirts while he sharpened tools or cleaned the barn latch. They didn't talk much during those hours, but the silence held a rhythm like a song hummed under breath. The hens clucked lazily near the coop. 3 of them had stopped laying, but she let them stay. They'd earned their peace. By mid-morning, Wyatt came up the path, with gloves tucked into his belt cheeks red from the wind. He paused near the porch when he saw her, but didn't call out until he was closer. "Post-holding?" he asked, glancing at the shirt she was pinning. "Dry earth near the cottonwoods. Might need to soak it tonight," she replied. "I boiled the last of the black beans," she added. "They'll keep warm till noon." He studied her a moment, then reached for a damp sleeve. "You still thinking about leaving?" She turned her face toward his, the line between them flapping once in the breeze. "I did at first, and now I wake before the sun. I tend a stove I didn't build. Feed hens I didn't buy. Sleep in a bed that still creaks under my weight." She rested her hands on her hips. "But I don't feel like I'm borrowing anymore." He nodded slowly. "You're not." She pulled the last shirt from the basket and pinned it beside the others. The cloth swayed gently. "I got a letter yesterday," Wyatt said after a pause. She looked at him. "From Everett? He's back on his feet. Staying with kin near Butte." She didn't answer right away. "He asked about you." Francis dusted her hands on her apron. "Did you write him back?" "Not yet. Don't tell him more than he needs to know." "I won't." The wind picked up again. Wyatt reached for the basket, but Francis caught his hand without thinking. His skin was warm, calloused, but his grip softened as their fingers settled together. "What comes next?" "I didn't expect to feel at home again," she said quietly. "But I do." Wyatt stepped closer, their hands still linked. "I didn't expect to want more than what I had." He swallowed. "But I do now." Francis's throat tightened. Her fingers curled around his. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." She looked at him, eyes wide but steady. "Would you build another room onto the house? One with space for a cradle beside the stove?" Wyatt drew in a breath deep and slow. Something in his face changed, not fear or hesitation, but something unguarded open in a way she hadn't seen before. "I already drew the plans," he said. Francis laughed, then soft and sudden a sound she hadn't made in years. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her breath catching. They stood like that until the sun cleared the edge of the trees. Around them, the world went quiet. Inside, the house was still. Outside, the wind shifted through the tall grass, and in that space between 2 people who had once been abandoned, now stood not as strangers, but as something new. That winter settled in deep and quiet. They spent the dark months side by side, stitching curtains, sealing cracks in the walls, watching the fire dwindle and rise again. They talked of spring, of planting beans, ordering a milk cow, maybe teaching a neighbor's child to read, of naming something not yet born, but already waiting. By March, the new room stood a small space with a window that caught the morning light just right. Francis moved her mending basket to a bench beside the cradle and began stitching a quilt from old shirts and flour sacks. Wyatt carved toys from leftover cedar, smoothing every edge by hand. The baby came just after the thaw, a girl with strong lungs and wide dark eyes. They named her Lily for the wildflowers that bloomed near the creek when the snow melted. That first night, Francis held her close. Wyatt seated beside the bed, his hand resting gently on the curve of her knee. "I never thought I'd be needed like this," she whispered. He leaned in, brushing his lips against her temple. "You're not just needed," he said. "You're home." Spring in the bones. Spring arrived in whispers. The snow receded from the pasture in patchy folds like a blanket slowly peeled back. Mud clung to the wagon wheels, and the porch boards darkened with thaw. Beneath the cold, life stirred. The creek behind the house sang again. A thin trail of green crept along the fence posts where the sagebrush hadn't yet given up. Francis stood at the threshold of the house. One morning, Lily cradled against her shoulder, her other arm propped against the door frame as she watched the world wake up. Wyatt was already outside. He moved slow now, not from age or injury, but because there was no need to rush anymore. He laid new fencing with measured care, letting the hammer speak for him, post by post. Each strike was a kind of prayer, not loud, not desperate, just steady. The house had changed too, not in any dramatic way, but in the kind of details only someone who lived there would notice. Curtains stitched from feed sacks now framed the windows. A wooden shelf above the stove held jars of beans and dried apples. The new room glowed golden in the morning, and the cradle beneath the window caught the sun in a soft wash of light. Inside, Frances moved quietly. Her days were full mending, tending, rocking. Her hands no longer trembled when she folded a quilt or stirred a pot. The ache she had carried from Kansas City, sharp and constant, had softened into something else. Not gone entirely, but gentled. Some afternoons she would sit with Lily on her lap and read aloud from the old book she'd brought in her bag. Wyatt would carve nearby his fingers, shaping cedar into small animals, or blocks for Lily to someday stack and tumble. They didn't talk much in those hours. They didn't need to. There was no clock in the house, no bell to mark the hour. Time passed in the way a field grows unseen, slow but certain. Wyatt planted squash and beans in the patch behind the house. Frances kept hens that clucked at her heels like gossiping old women. The well ran clear. The roof held through rain. They hadn't spoken the word forever. Neither of them needed to. What they had was steadier than vows. One evening, Frances leaned against Wyatt as they sat on the porch, Lily asleep against her chest. She looked out over the land, her voice a murmur. "Do you think she'll remember this?" Wyatt glanced down at the child, then back at the hills. "She won't remember the cold or the quiet, but she'll know she was safe." Frances nodded, her eyes full. "I used to think safety was something you had to find." He touched her hand gently. "Sometimes it's something you build." The cradle beside the stove. The wind returned in the evenings, brushing past the eaves like it had somewhere to be. But it no longer howled. It whispered now, as if respecting the silence within. Inside the house, the stove glowed warm. The walls, once bare and waiting, were now full of presence. A child's breath in the night, the creak of Wyatt's boots crossing to check the latch. Frances humming low as she folded linens by firelight. They built more than a room that winter. They built patterns, traditions, quiet comforts, Sunday biscuits with molasses. The way Wyatt always left a flower on the table, wild-picked, or in winter a pine cone dusted with snow. The way Frances always smoothed Lily's blanket twice before laying her down. It was never spoken aloud, but between them lived a rhythm that needed no explanation. Some days the past came knocking, not with fury, but memory. A glance at a letter tucked in the back of a drawer. The sound of a train whistle far off in the valley. But Frances no longer flinched. She had not forgotten what it meant to be left waiting. She had simply outgrown it. Wyatt never asked if she missed the city, and Frances never asked if he regretted stepping in for Everett. Their silences were not the kind born from avoidance, but from understanding, the kind shared by people who had seen the edge of loneliness and chosen to turn back together. One late spring afternoon, Wyatt came in with dirt on his boots and sun on his brow. Francis looked up from the cradle where Lily cooed at a strip of muslin. "She's strong," Wyatt said, nodding toward their daughter. "She gets that from you," Francis replied. He paused, then knelt to run a hand gently along Lily's belly. "No, she gets it from the woman who waited on a platform and didn't let the world break her." Francis didn't answer. She didn't need to. She reached for Wyatt's hand and pressed it over Lily's chest, then her own. One heartbeat, 2, 3, a family. As dusk settled across the land, the wind passed through the window soft and fragrant with pine and dust. The porch creaked under the weight of the day's heat, and the fence line stood tall against the lavender sky. Inside the house, they had built slowly, honestly, with care. 3 hearts beat as one. And this time, no one was waiting alone.